Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you've had a great week. And so this is just another episode here of Living the Wildlife. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we deal with vertebrate pest control, all things related to the control and management of vertebrate pest species. If you're not quite sure what that means, animals with a spine. So as you know, insects, normally we don't call them animals, but they actually are. Insects don't have a spine. However, mammals, and birds, and other, in the, I think the genus? What's not genus? No, it must be the, not phylum, but it's way up there. Order, perhaps, maybe a little bit higher than that. Chordata, you might have heard of that. But anyways, I'm not sure I'm getting the right term there, but the category. But it's way up there, and so underneath that are things like rodents and birds and carnivores and ungulates and those types of species. So basically the big stuff that we deal with here. So I don't really deal with insects unless they intersect with wildlife, and then we'll deal with that because of disease issues for you. But today we're not going to be talking about disease issues. Wanted to talk a little bit about porcupine. But before I do that, do take a few moments. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you on board there. Then join us on Facebook on the Pest Geek Podcast web page with Facebook. We'd love to have you there, talk about your triumphs and your trials, of course. And you can always reach out to me at email. Email is the best. I know a lot of you don't like to use email. I'm sorry. Sometimes messaging is a bit cumbersome for me. Email is definitely better. Reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you, your thoughts about the show, maybe ideas that you may have for future shows, or perhaps you have someone that you might want to be interested in having me interview them, perhaps in the show, and perhaps you want yourself interviewed. Maybe you have a new product, a new technique. We'd love to have you. Part of the goal of this podcast is to bring out new information to those in the industry in wildlife control, because, you know, we're not very unified in our industry. And so information is sometimes difficult to do, to get, to navigate through. And so we're trying to break through that, try to bridge the gap between the researchers and the practitioner. Of course, that's what many of you are. Of course, you're out there doing the practitioner. So that's kind of how I see my role there. Those of you who don't know me, my day job is I'm a vertebrate pest specialist for a state Department of Agriculture. I am not representing the state here. I want to make sure that's very clear. I'm here on my own. But that's what I do in my day job. And so I'm not in the field every day doing wildlife control. I do get out in the field. Some people have the mistaken notion that I don't do things in the field. That is a lie and a misrepresentation. So you would have to decide why people would want to say that about me, but it's not true. I don't, but certainly it's true that I'm not out there every day grinding it out the way you folks are. So I have that little bit of an academic side and then a little bit of a educational side, and that's kind of my role. But I'm not out there pounding the doors, trying to get customers and doing that. So when I'm getting out in the field, I'm either providing a consultation or I'm perhaps doing some research in, you know, and I don't want to overstate what the research is. Sometimes I'm doing things like proof of concept, seeing if something might work and seeing if it'd be practical for a field use. It's not necessarily peer reviewable research, although I've done some of that. Certainly, it sometimes lacks the repetitive rigor that's required for peer-reviewed publication, but certainly it is of a step above ordinary, just, anecdotal information, because I am taking records more than what people would often do when they're trying something out on their own. All right, enough about me. We want to talk today about porcupines. And so let me bring my PowerPoint up. I figured, we're getting into the fall here, and this is often a time where people begin to have some porcupine issues. So I thought, let's talk a little bit about porcupines. And so porcupines are pretty cool. So today I'm just going to talk about some of the biological issues related to porcupines, kind of to give you a little thumbnail sketch survey of the life history of porcupines. And then in the future podcast, we'll talk about the control methods and some things about porcupine management that would be useful for you in the field. But first, we're going to need to understand our opponent, understand the pest, understand the animal, have an appreciation for that before we learn how to manage the damage. So let's take a look. So porcupine, this is a picture I took. I met this particular porcupine on the side of the road. It's going to be hard to see in this particular image, but this particular porcupine got quilled, and he was just sitting on the side of the road and just basically crying. He was very unhappy. I even took a video of this guy. I think I posted it on YouTube. So you can look at it there if you wish. But this poor person, I think there might have been a mating issue going on. But anyways, whatever it was, he was on the losing. This poor guy was on the losing. I don't know whether it's a female or male. My suspicion is it's a male, but I don't know that for sure. But this poor guy was certainly hurting, to be sure. Got quilled in his face, and so he was not having a good day. So porcupines, what do they weigh? Well, it depends on what part of the country you're in. But as a general rule of thumb, 10 to 13 pounds would be a good size. Understand they get the heaviest just before the fall hits, because they have to survive the winter. They don't really hibernate, so they've got to have enough fat to carry them through. So they get the heaviest then. Of course, the thinnest they would be is obviously the spring. As you go higher up the latitude, and it's like in Canada, the porcupines can get larger. That's often a phenomenon with different wildlife, that as the farther north you go, the tendency, it's not perfect, the tendency is that they get larger. Okay, so there's some biological reasons for that. So in terms of their total length, remember total length when we're talking about biological issues includes the tail. So it's from the tip of the nose to the tip of the bone of the tail. So their total length ranges anywhere from 24 to 37 inches, and obviously there's some wiggle room there. And then the tail itself can be anywhere from 7 to 13 inches, obviously, depending on the size of the animal. So you're looking at about a tail, almost a little less than a third of the length of its total body. And so just to keep that in mind. What is their range? Well, they actually cover a substantial part of the United States, certainly the majority of Canada. They're well into Alaska, of course. They're not really found in the southeastern quarter of the United States, but they even find their way down into Mexico, which was a little surprising to me, actually. I did not know that. So they cover a pretty big area. They tend, in the parts of the Great Plains and the desert, of course, they're primarily going to be found in areas that have what they call riparian, which is just a fancy word for where there's constant water. That's where the trees are going to be, and that's where you're going to find the porcupines in those areas that have tree growth and lots of vegetation. You're not going to find a porcupine in the middle of the desert, which is, things are just dying of thirst, basically. If he's there, something went wrong. Maybe somebody dumped him there, or he was traveling to try to get to another stream that he thought was down the road. Because they're not very mobile. They're not really great. They don't move very well. So they can't be traveling far. Not like a coyote that can cover miles and miles in a day. So their movements, as I mentioned, kind of gave you a little bit of a hint earlier. Their home range, again, a home range is where you're going to find them on a normal period, right? So think of it, your home range would be your home where you reside, where you sleep at night, to where you go to your job. And so that is your home range. You kind of just move it out, put the radius out there and draw a circle around it. That's going to be typically your home range. For porcupines, it's anywhere from 1.5
to 59 hectares. Now, if you're not familiar with what a hectare is 2.2 acres. So you're looking at somewhere around 3 to 5 acres at the low end to well into 112 or 15 acres. So with 60, no, that'd be 120. Add another 20%, so maybe 150 acres. So really not a lot of space when you think about it. So if you're having a client with a porcupine problem that's being persistent, understand that that porcupine is going to be somewhere within 150 acres of your spot. And it may be very, very close. So that's something for you to think about in terms of how you're addressing that. So how much they want to pay you to go search for maybe its den, because if you're trapping porcupine, obviously if you can get closer to the den, that's going to be a whole lot easier than trying to necessarily bait them into a trap. Their maximum dispersal, that's, when the young are getting mature and they're getting kicked out and moving on their way, you're looking at about 10 kilometers. And again, a kilometer is just a little bit more than half a mile. So again, we're, 5 to 6 miles thereabouts. And so that's not really a long ways in all things considered, right? So again, it's not a very mobile animal. And so just another little factoid here is that when they climb, a squirrel can climb a tree face up, or it can go down face down, but a porcupine can't. A porcupine is always head up. So whether he goes up, facing up, but if he comes down, he's still facing up. Interesting factoid that may be important for you if you're looking to trap in maybe a tree situation or in a vertical situation where the porcupine is done. Typically, porcupines are trapped on the ground, but wildlife control operators, you are a creative bunch, and so that may be a fact that you want to keep in mind, that if you're catching a porcupine that's already in the tree, you need to make sure you're compensating with your trapping, then understand he's going to come down into it backwards. So if you're using a conibear, you're going to have to think about that. Shelter, where do the porcupines live? Well, they can live inside of trees. They can also live inside of burrows that have been created by other species. So this, things like badgers, they can take over abandoned coyote dens and this sort of thing. But they don't dig their own burrows, and that's important for you to understand. So they're not going to create they're not creating their own builders. They're not like a badger or a woodchuck that's out there digging away to create their own spot. They're going to exploit what's already there. And so that is something that's important for you to understand. They're not creating their own burrow. And so they also like to get into rock shelters. That's something very common for them. The idea is they're looking for protection against the wind and the snow. But they don't fill it with debris to help them insulate it or anything. They're not like a squirrel that's packing in a lot of stuff to insulate it. They're just kind of going in to kind of get out of the brunt of the wind and probably the brunt of the snow, and they're just sort of hanging on there. And so it's I don't know, it's a tough life if you're a porcupine, right? So it's certainly not a great way to live. They will live inside of a tree dens as well. So if there's a large enough excavation, perhaps in a tree, maybe carved out by some woodpeckers, then they will certainly exploit that if it's available. And they will reuse dens. So one of the clues you're looking for is just this pile of fecal matter. And it's hard to see in this particular photo. Maybe if I try to blow it up a little bit, you can see all that brown material is fecal. A lot of that's fecal material back in there. You may think it's just leaves and stuff. Well, there's leaves in there, but it's primarily fecal material that just builds up over time that they use. And I don't think I know why. I certainly don't know why they are doing it that way. Maybe it's kind of putting an odor there to prevent predators from chasing after them. Don't know. So it's just one of the things that maybe I'll find out when I do some more reading on this particular species. What do they feed on? Well, they are strict vegetarians. Now we have to say strict because a lot of the animals we call vegetarian are not pure vegetarian. I call it, they like to stray, sort of like that cousin that's a vegan comes over to your house And all of a sudden you're noticing that some of the bacon you cooked the previous day is disappearing, right? So sometimes vegans aren't as vegan as they want you to think they are. Well, the same way with a lot of our vegetarian animals, they're not pure vegetarians. Well, the porcupine is a strict vegetarian, so it's not going to be out there chomping away on a dead animal. Where you have ground squirrels, for instance. Ground squirrels are vegetarian, but they will take a little taste of protein, animal protein, when they have the opportunity. And so you will see them eating other ground squirrels that have been hit by cars, for instance. They'll be out there chowing away. They do defecate 3 times a day. It's interesting that the researchers discovered that, and with up to 180 pellets per day. So there's a little bit more of a close-up on what some of those pellets. So just like all rodents have that sort of oblong, circular, oblong shape with rounded ends and maybe a little point on one end, that is your classic sign of a porcupine. So all your rodent scats tend to mirror one another. So if you've ever seen a mouse scat or a rat scat, you see that tubular style to them. Porcupines are the same way. Beaver are the same way. It's just they just get bigger as the animals get bigger. Okay, and there's some other small distinctions there, but you're going to see porcupine droppings typically in bunches. And how do they feed? Well, in the summer, they obviously have a lot more succulent vegetation available because things are growing and things are green. Winter, it becomes very selective because you don't have all that leafy vegetation available to them. So they've got to pick trees that are going to be giving them the highest amount of energy. That's where they're eating the cambium layer. That's when you strip the bark away. It's that portion of the tree's exterior that has all those nutrients underneath. So they have the protective bark, and then just below that, the cambium layer, where you have all those nutrients. And that's what they're going for. They're trying to get those sugars. They're trying to get those carbohydrates to help keep them alive. So their nutrition really goes to hell during the wintertime. And that's why they're fattening up so much in the fall, because they've got to carry through that long winter because they're not getting great nutrition. They're getting some, but they're not getting great nutrition during the winter period. You can see their preferences: hemlock, red spruce, sugar maple. Those of you who are driving the car aren't going to be able to read this, obviously. Sugar maple, yellow birch, striped maple, beech, and balsam fir. Those are common species that they like. And of course, they may choose different species in your neck of the woods, as we call it. But so this is something for you as a professional that you need to pay attention to. Even if you can't identify the tree, take good photos of it, maybe take a sample of the leaf, get a good close-up on the bark, and try to find out at least what the genus of that particular tree is, because you may find that helpful in terms of your trapping and control methods down the road, right? So where are you going to put your trap? Well, you want to put it in a location where the porcupine is probably going to go, right? So that can be certainly helpful in that regard. Porcupines are really attracted to salt. They love salt. They're salt deprived. And that's one of the reasons why they get whacked on roads so much, is because the porcupine is not always just crossing the road. Sometimes they linger on the road trying to get salt off that particular road. So think about that when it comes to baiting. If they love salt so much, then what do you think? Salt may be an important part of your baiting mechanism. I know I wasn't going to focus much on control methods today, but I want you to understand that knowing the biology of an animal is essential for you to be effective in controlling that particular animal. And so we're focusing a little bit on trapping here, but obviously if salt is an issue, if you can eliminate salt, that's going to eliminate probably some gnawing damage as well. That's why they'll go after things like the handles of shovels and rakes, because as people are working with those particular items, the salts in their skin are getting impregnated into that wood. Porcupine's going to chow in the wood because he wants the salt, right? So those are some things for you to think about. And then it may not be practical to try to wash those things off, especially if it's embedded into wood. But if you have areas where you can maybe eliminate salt, that may reduce the attractiveness of a particular location. But if you're trying to trap, you want to be using salt. One way to do it, as I've heard, is saltine crackers. So that's just something for you to think about. Scat, as I talked before, this is definitely a better photo of that. Let me kind of blow that up for you. Notice that tubular look there. And there it is. Notice how piled in. I put a penny on it as well to show you some scale of what that scat looks like. And so this is a porcupine den, and you can see all the feces there piled up. And they will reuse these sites year after year, so you can get a fair amount of scat here in terms of locating this den. Now, obviously, if you're in the business of controlling the porcupines, you want to find these dens, and so you're going to be looking for those types of droppings. Reproduction-wise, females are sexually mature at about 18 months, so they're not high reproductive animals, and they have one pup. Notice the gestation period. Gestation period is the time that she becomes fertilized to the time she gives birth. 2/3 of a year, that is a really long time when you think about it. So, or at least half a year, 365. So maybe I really should say half a year, but almost, over half a year, that's amazing. So that's a very low population rate. So you're never going to have a lot of porcupines in there. It's not like rabbits. Well, whoa, we're killing them all the time. And so you literally could wipe out the population in a given area of porcupines, and very, very quickly, because their reproductive rate is very, very low. The pup's quills harden within 1 hour after birth, which is amazing. So that little pup is ready to go. Within an hour, those quills are hard enough to give it some protection right off the bat, which is amazing. Which is an amazing thing. In terms of their behavior, porcupines tend to be loners, right? So you're not going to find them in massive clusters. They're not herding animals. They're not like cattle. They will den together during the winter, especially if dens are in short supply, and they are capable of swimming. They're actually quite buoyant, according to one of the literatures. They're quite buoyant. They're not big in water. They don't love water, but they will cross water if they need to. As a general rule, again, not a strict rule, as a general rule of thumb, they're rarely active below 18 degrees centigrade. So I think that's somewhere around 0 Fahrenheit, if memory serves. Let me make a quick check of that to see what the Fahrenheit conversion would be. This is an app I use for conversions, and I didn't convert this. So let me let's go negative 18 Celsius. Negative 18 equals. Oh, it's actually a below 0 Fahrenheit. So I was pretty close there. Negative 0.4. So that's pretty good. So it's about 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty cold. There is a report in one of the pieces of literature that I looked at. They had them going out at negative 34, if memory serves, negative 34 Celsius, and that would have been, let's see here, that's negative 29 Fahrenheit. So that's pretty cold. But who knows what the reason for that? Again, whenever we're talking about these numbers with wildlife, it's really important to understand that these are generalities. There's always going to be, is what I call the crazy uncle phenomenon. That is, there's always going to be some outlier animals that just sort of break the rules. And so you always want to keep that in mind. As I say, animals will make liars of us all the time. And so you need to be sure you keep that in mind when we're looking at some of these numbers. But as a rule of thumb, it is helpful to realize that if you're going to be trapping at a location and it's 0 degrees, it's probably not worth your while to set the trap. It may be worth your while to place it, wire the door open, and just have it baited, and then come back when you're getting a little bit of a warm spell. Because you might just be checking traps, or someone's checking traps for probably useless when it's that cold. Other species with wildlife are the same way. It's just not worth it if you're using a trapping method to control them in certain types of harsh weather. It's just not the best time to do it. In terms of porcupine quills, of course, they're famous for their quills. This is sort of a electron microscope view that's been converted into sort of a line drawing. If you ever have a chance to look at a microscope image of a quill, you'll notice these sort of barbs because it only goes one way. So the idea being is when the quill hits, it breaks off of the porcupine. They don't throw their quills, right? There's no throwing of their quills. It will break off, and it will continue to embed itself deeper and deeper into the animal that it penetrated. Why? Because those spines prevent it from coming back out the other way. You say, well, how do we get them out of our dogs? Well, we'll talk about that, but it's not easy, right? And so you have to understand that you need that it kind of goes in one way. And so a lot of times animals will die because that porcupine quill will weave its way through and just tear up tissue in this way. Now, interestingly enough, there is an antibacterial agent in the quill. So oftentimes it won't get as infected as it would ordinarily because of that antibiotic element in the quill, which is kind of strange. Some people believe that that's to help protect the porcupine when he falls out of the tree and impales himself, that he doesn't get an infection. So I'll let you decide on that. The length of the quills varies, of course. They can be up to 75 millimeters in length. And so again, we're using scientific terminology here. So let's give you an idea of what the longest length would be. So in terms of millimeter, we can go to 75. And what does that equal in terms of inches? That's about 3 inches in length. So that's something serious when you think about it, a 3-inch quill. And then they get compressively smaller in different parts of the body. So typically the area around the tail and its backside are the longest quills, with everywhere else the quills are shorter. Now, they don't have quills everywhere. They don't have quills in the bottom of their feet, of course, and they don't have quills on their belly. But they do have some quills on their cheek and their sacral area, of course, and even their forehead. So they're vulnerable underneath themselves, and so that's clearly an issue. The width of these quills can be anywhere from 2 to 3 millimeters, depending on what part of the body they're located on. Sometimes they're down as small as 1 millimeter in terms of their diameter. And the porcupine has about over 30,000 of these quills, and they will grow back. When they lose them, they will grow new ones. It takes a few weeks, but they will grow them. So they're not going to miss the quills, right? So they won't, take all you want, we'll make more. And that's what a porcupine will do in this regard. So I wanted to talk a little bit about quill removal. And so I found this particular website because there's a lot of mythology about how to remove quills. And so this particular website I thought would be important to give it some kudos here. This is called tier1vet.com, tier1vet.com, and it's about quill removal. And this particular veterinarian talks about the issue of how to handle porcupine quill removal. And so what she says in a nutshell, here's that electron microscope view. Pretty neat. Let me kind of blow that up a little bit more for you, for those of you that are watching online. See the barbs on that. That puppy's only going one way, and there's a photo of it in terms of how we would see it. But you magnify that, those barbs mean that puppy's going one way. Okay, so it's pretty neat. And you want to have, when you want to remove this quill, you do want to remove the quills, you've got to make sure that you get the entire quill. So if you're not careful in how you're pulling the quill, it can break. And now you have this quill deep inside body tissue that can sit there and fester. And that can be a significant issue. So you don't want to cut the quill. That just reduces the size, as you say. You don't want to twist the quill because you run the risk of breaking it. And you don't want to soften the quills. It won't make them more likely to be pulled out. It actually makes it more likely to break. So she said you get yourself a pair of pliers and you get to the base of that quill, close to the body as you can, and you want to pull out slowly and gradually but firmly in the direction, with the opposite way the quill went in. So you don't want to make sure, if the quill went in this way, you need to pull the exact opposite way. Pulling one way or the other, you're going to end up breaking it. And then she says you got to make sure that you get all of it. And so this is why, of course, she's going to recommend that you go to a vet. Nevertheless, this is something that many people, my grandfather used to talk about how they would take a pitchfork and anchor the dog down, put it around his neck, anchor the dog down, and pull the pliers out and yank the quills. But that's old school, to be sure. Maybe some of you have heard of that. But you want to be careful with this. This is serious business when someone gets quilled, especially if you accidentally get quilled. You want to take that seriously because you don't want that being broken off into your skin. People have died from quills, particularly if they're eating them. It can perforate different parts of their body. So it's serious when we're dealing with quills. Thankfully, they don't throw their quills. You've got to make contact with the porcupine to get quilled. So they're not going to be, so if you stay away, you're going to be fine. Make sure you're wearing thick gloves, of course, and being mindful of how you're treating that porcupine when you're trying to capture it. All right. Well, that's the basic life history and biology and some elements of porcupines. And I hope you enjoyed that. Certainly, I certainly found it fascinating to learn more about porcupines because I've never trapped one. I was close. I was trying to capture one when I was doing some field work with my job, and no, that porcupine did not come. Where maybe he was already gone when we were setting it because we saw the evidence of him up in a tree, and did not get that porcupine. But nevertheless, I was glad to be out there doing some trapping to try to. I caught other animals, but I didn't catch that. Didn't catch that porcupine. Thank you so much for taking some time today and sharing it with me and letting me talk about porcupines. Even if you don't have them in your area, you never know, their range can be changing, and so you may find them moving into the southeast for those of you who are some of our southeast listeners, to be sure. But most of the listeners in North America, of course, will be having porcupines in your particular area. So certainly in the majority of the United States, and of course almost all of Canada will have porcupines, and then a few down in the Mexico region. I don't know if they've moved. That map is pretty old. They may have moved a little farther south into Mexico, but they do occur in Mexico as well. So be careful with them. Admire the animals that we're working with. Next time I deal with porcupines, we'll get into some control methods on how to capture them, and manage them for your clients. So you have been listening to Living the Wildlife podcast. Again, we publish pretty much every Friday, sometimes on Saturday. Do hope you take the time to subscribe to the channel. Drop me a note, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your comments about the show, ideas for future podcasts. And if you, of course, want to be on the show, we'd be glad to have you. I am looking for a Norway rat feces. And so if you have some and you're willing to sell that to me, I would love to have you contact me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Yes, I am looking to purchase Norway rat scat. So I would love to get that. If you have some, I would love to buy it. What am I willing to pay? $20 for a collection. I'd like to have a minimum of 20. And I will also pay shipping as well. So if you have some and it's dry and it's intact, I would love to get it from you. Again, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'm also looking for other scats, so that if you're interested, you can reach out to me and ask me what I'm looking for. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we call it Living the Wildlife because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.